Your question was, can a warm spot turn into a cold spot? The answer to that would be, why a hotspot and a warm spot? This comes down to the client's need to generate equity and leverage into additional purchases. Some clients want to generate substantial equity right from the get-go, which means that they need to invest in a hotspot. Now, what are the hallmarks of a hotspot? Hotspot would generate...
If you had to pick 3 to 5 metrics that an individual can source the data easily and validate the data, what would they be?
So first data points that they need to discern or have an answer to would be...
Big question. Someone listening at home, and let's say if they wanted to create a buyer brief for themselves, how would they create a buyer's brief for themselves?
Buyer's brief range in complexity. So now, buyer's brief is essentially a strategy. And what is a strategy? Trend is your friend. Trend equals direction. So if you're establishing 4, 5, 6 year trends in your supply metrics, and if they're nosediving, for the trend to shift to neutral or to even increasing supply, it will require...
I always say you're either a stocks or property guy, so you're obviously a property guy.
That's right.
The information provided in this podcast is for general purposes only and should not be considered personal advice. Always consult with qualified professionals or experts in the relevant field for personalized advice tailored to your specific situation. Welcome to another episode of Catching Up with Property. In this episode, we're very fortunate to have Matija,
that's perfect, yeah.
You
can call me Matt, by the way, but yeah.
Matt from HtAGs. His specialty is bringing story to numbers. Now, if you have used a buyer's agent, your buyer's agent may have spent hours researching data, sifting and sorting to make sense of hotspots or warm spots. And most likely, they've probably used Matt and his program, HtAGs. Listen in, buckle up as we unpack the secrets of building your own buyer's brief.
Thanks, guys. Thank you. That's I guess, I think what you just said there is bringing story to numbers. That's, I guess, a perfect explanation of what we do. And thank you for inviting me.
Thank you.
Pleasure to be here.
And thanks for being here. How could you unpack what HtAGs actually does?
So it's a data platform. Essentially, it's a platform which provides you with statistics and numbers and metrics that allow you to, I guess, make the best decision. But it's one thing to have, numbers on a page and metrics on a page, and yet another thing to actually construct a coherent narrative out of the metrics with respect to your client's brief. Because every brief is different, which means that the metrics that you're looking at do not carry the same weighting for every individual. So to encapsulate what HtAG is about, it's about, I guess, providing the numbers and metrics upon which you can make a decision, but also assisting users to understand how one thing connects to another into a story that has no holes in the argument. That's essentially it, I guess an elevator pitch.
No holes in the argument.
Yeah, no, exactly. That's what you need. I mean, a brief, it can be very complex, it can be very simple, and it can have, 3, 4, 5, 10 different parameters, and you need to satisfy those parameters. And then those parameters relate to the metrics, which you use to actually conduct research and find the best location for the brief.
So the data sets, the data brief helps you zoom in.
Correct. It's a funnel-like approach, and the data and the metrics shift on the basis of the brief. And I think that's the essential thing that we must maintain. We must maintain the connection between the brief and how we research, and then that informs the asset selection. Usually we see a bit of a jump between the brief straight away to the asset selection, and that's completely the wrong way to go about it. So you need to have a coherent, I guess, a link and a connection between those 3 stages: brief, research, asset selection.
So in that selection process, would there be a point in time where you have to have boots on the ground to
Absolutely.
Verify.
Absolutely. So this is the power of, I guess, most of our subscribers are buyers agents and mortgage brokers as well. I would say about 70% of our subscriber base is professionals. Out of those professionals, it will be maybe 60-40 buyers agents and mortgage brokers, and then you have the 30% of everyday investors. So the beauty about the service and the product is the combination of the two minds. So the buyers agent mind, who's very skilled at selecting selecting an asset, picking the right street, choosing one property over another. But then before that asset selection, layering everything with the metrics and that, I guess, narrative that elicits the brief. When you connect the two, it becomes extremely powerful. And this is what eliminates anxiety for buyers agents. They know that they're not going to buy in the wrong location.
And I guess you answered my next question, which is your platform for professionals or is it available for investors?
It's both. So we have two separate communities attached to the platform as well. They're called the Mastermind community. So every person that subscribes to the platform also gets access to the professional community, which would be mainly buyers, agents and mortgage brokers. And then you have an investor community, everyday investors who want to purchase a property. And in those communities, we actually teach our proprietary methodology on how to actually come to the right locations for your brief. And it is very complex in a sense that, it requires a time investment from people in total, maybe 2 or 3 days. And there's certain steps and processes that you need to take. But if you do take them, you first educate yourself throughout the process, which is the most important thing. And you eliminate any form of anxiety when it comes to your final choice.
Yeah, beautiful. And then what's your property journey been like?
Yeah, so it's had its ups and downs. I started investing about 15 or 20 years ago. The first property that I bought was land in Gregory Hills. I remember I bought
You'd be laughing now.
Absolutely. I mean, I bought it for 250. I remember 600 square meter block, and now it's 800 or 900 worth. In the process, we also bought, when I say we're buying under HtAG banner as well. So we bought in Adelaide. A lot we bought in Southwest as well. We have some in the Shire region also. So there's about 8 or 9, I think 9 properties now. And we also bought some properties overseas.
You bought properties overseas?
Correct. So we bought properties back home. I'm from Serbia, but we bought properties in Montenegro, apartments because of much higher yields and the entry point is much lower. So you can buy an apartment there for, 150,000 euros or 100. We actually bought it for 100. Did the renovation. Renovation was about 20,000 euros. So that was 120 and now it's worth 180, but the yields are astronomical. You know what I mean? So it's just, and it's Airbnb essentially, Airbnb game.
So all tourists?
Yeah, it's all tourists. Yeah, because it's all Airbnb because it's right on the water. It's in Montenegro. It's right on the water. Yeah. We've been really lucky to source that one. And we're also building 10 apartments in Montenegro as well. Yeah. So it's a bit of most of the money that we generate from the business actually goes towards building HtAG, but anything that's left over, we try to invest as much as we can.
In property.
Yeah.
And I always say you're either a stocks or property guy. So you're obviously a property guy.
That's right. Personally, I'm also a crypto guy a little,
I'm an ex-banker. I don't believe in crypto.
So I started down that rabbit hole as well. But if I had to consider my portfolio, that would be, the degen bet, like as they call it, about, 5% of the portfolio.
The burning, the burning part.
That's right.
So let's talk data and some ideas. What are the basic data points that someone buying an investment property should be using? And what I might mean by this is if you had to pick 3 to 5 metrics that an individual can source the data easily and validate the data, what would they be? So if they didn't have HtAG. Okay,
I'm going to go a step before that a little to answer that question. So first data points that they need to discern or have an answer to would be, what is their price point? What is their investment time horizon? And what's their risk profile? So they need to think about those 3 things. And then that informs which data points they look at, you know? So it's not a simple answer, but I don't want to make it too complex as well. If your investment time horizon is long-term, things that you need to look at is, I guess, the overall growth rate cycles of the area. You need to look at, I guess, the socio-economics of the area, and you need to look at potentially at industry centralization or exposure to negative environmental effects. If your data
What do you mean by negative environmental effects?
I mean bushfire, flooding, erosion.
Oh, right. Okay.
Yeah. I mean bushfire, flooding and erosion. So that's about 3 there. They're a bit composite, but that's 3. When it comes to short-term investing, you essentially need to look at supply and demand dynamics. By that, I mean you need to look at the supply side, which would be stock on market, inventory, building approvals and hold periods. Days on market is the demand side. So then you switch over to the demand side and you look at days on market, vacancy rates, buy search index and clearance rates. Those are the main metrics. I've given you more than 3 that you've asked, but I think it's essential to look at all of those. And the most important thing in any area analysis is the analysis of trends as opposed to current values. So that's a tip that I would like to give to anyone. You need to look at trends because trends equal direction, and property is an illiquid asset. Going back to our discussion about, stocks and crypto, those are volatile assets in a sense that they do exchange hands on intraday basis.
Yes.
Property takes a long time to exchange hands.
You gotta sell, market.
Correct. So when you establish direction of a particular metric, you can also infer what's going to happen in the future. So this is where the prediction comes in.
Yeah, beautiful. And then following from that, does the data set change if your investment strategy is different? And what I mean by that is buying an investment as a set and forget versus buying an investment property for manufactured growth.
Absolutely changes. So I just had a recent discussion with a customer of ours regarding that. So even set and forget part of the equation, the data changes on the basis of the price point. So I'm not going to go too much into it, but I'll give you an example. If you're investing in areas that are 500k and below, then the socioeconomics do not play a big role because socioeconomics are already lower on the scale. So there's no large correlation between, high socioeconomic standard and long-term growth for asset values that are 500k and below. So the socioeconomics can be downgraded and put to the side more.
Yeah.
In that instance, you more assess supply and demand. Now, when it comes to difference between set and forget, I'm not going to go into different price points under set and forget because it's a large discussion or long discussion. But when it comes between set and forget and let's say adding value, it all comes to understanding market momentum. So with set and forget, you require market momentum in order to generate capital growth. When it comes to adding value, you don't require market momentum as such. You require the particulars of the site to enable you to generate equity right from the onset, either from development, adding value, renovation, etc. Sometimes you have, adding value strategies where you want to develop and sell off.
Yeah.
In that instance, market momentum doesn't play big of a role. What does play big of a role is, for example, if you want to sell it off and let's say you're building apartments, you want to discern the demand for those apartments in that area. So you want to tick those boxes. You want to know that the demand for apartments is high, which means that once you develop it, you'll be able to sell off your stock. And you also want to determine whether there's an oversaturation of that stock within that market because scarcity is a very important aspect. There are other value add strategies such as, for example, renovating or putting a granny flat, etc., where you can generate some equity from that perspective. But because you're also going to hold that asset for a long period of time, then you come to a position where you need to do a mix and match in a sense that, yes, I'll add value, but I also want to see how this market is going to perform long term because I'm going to be holding it. So it becomes a combination of two factors, purely add value and sell off. Market momentum doesn't play a role. What does play a role is to determine that what you're developing has scarcity so you can sell it off quickly.
So set and forget is market momentum.
So set and forget will be market momentum, and then you need to analyze supply and demand metrics and long-term factors. Then you have value add with set and forget. This is where you also need to consider market momentum.
Yeah.
And then you have value add where you're going to develop, flip and sell. And then in that instance, you just need to determine whether the asset that you're developing into has scarcity so you can sell it off quicker and doesn't sit on the market.
Has demand or need in that area.
Yeah.
Does the data set change if you're buying in different price categories? That is between, so for example, a 300k price category versus a 600k price category? It
does change. It does change absolutely. So one example would be the socio-economics. For example, when you're buying in the 300k category, you're already buying in towns that are of low socio-economic standard. So the primary factor there for momentum would be to ascertain the supply and demand dynamics. I'll give you an example, Broken Hill. Broken Hill has an IRSAD score of 2 out of 10 from memory, So you can't discount Broken Hill on the socio-economics because inadvertently the price point also dictates or informs the socio-economics. You will never find an area that has a 300k typical value and has a very high socioeconomic standard.
And what's IRS?
IRSAD is essentially an amalgamated metric produced by ABS, which showcases the socioeconomic standard of the area, and it has a subset of 20 different metrics that inform that score.
Wow. Okay, great.
So if you're going to, for example, 600k price points, you would want that 600k to have the ability to go towards the 900k or $1 million. This is where the socioeconomics play a role. You will never see, or you will rarely see, I would not say never, But a property investment is a game of probability. You need to increase the probability of a particular outcome.
Yeah.
So to increase the probability of a 600K asset going to $1 million, you have to consider the socio-economic standard of the area, because it becomes very rare for an area to be 1 million price point and yet have a socio-economic score of 1 or 2 out of 10. Now, affordability index also shifts. For example, we have a metric on our platform called the affordability index, which takes into account typical price, interest rates, and median incomes of the suburb, and we allocate 50% of median incomes towards mortgage repayments.
Which is pretty generous.
Well, the thing is, though, everyone is saying 30, but there's been recent research, I think done by Westpac, which is now saying that it's more 50. And when you think about it, because of, I guess, the devaluing of currency, constant printing, as well as increasing of prices, you do see that effect of there's more going towards the mortgage repayments.
Yep.
So now the affordability index, we call it a years to own. It does shift depending on the price points. For price points that are 500K and below, you need to have about a years to own. Let's say mortgage term is 30 years essentially. So you need to have about years to own of around 30. And affordability index is very important because it generates both internal and external demand. So what do I mean by that? So internal demand is usually demand from owner-occupiers or from residents within that suburb. And what usually happens is when you're seeing growth usually starts by generating the internal demand, owner-occupiers start increasing, demand from owner-occupiers starts increasing. They start purchasing property. It causes a positive feedback loop, which in financial theory is called reflexivity. It's being termed by George Soros. So when it causes reflexivity, it invites external demand or investors, which causes, again, a positive feedback loop and compounded growth. So you need that affordability aspect in order to onset the internal demand. Now, for 600K price point, the affordability shifts a little, so it wouldn't be 30 years to own, it will potentially go to 40. So when you're constructing an research algorithm, which is a collection of metrics and associated values, the values do shift on the basis of the price point that you're entering under. This is the methodology that we teach. So I've just given you 2 metrics. There are other metrics that are taken into consideration. Give an example. For example, if you're developing in regional towns who have a diversified economy, not centralized, diversified, then infrastructure spending plays a key role as well. So you want to have a look at how much infrastructure spending is, how much government is spending in that area on infrastructure. So there's certain, combinations of metrics that become very important depending on the location and the price point.
Yeah, right. And then just a question that just popped up. So the IRSD. IRSAD. That metric, what's a good and a bad?
So 10 is great socioeconomics, and you would see that, let's say, speaking in Sydney terms, you'll see that in Double Bay. 1 is obviously the worst on the scale. What is 1?
Like a regional.
1, I think Broken Hill is 2. Melton South is 1. That's in Victoria. In Sydney, I'm not sure whether Mount Druitt will be 1. I don't think it will be 1. But this is the disparity that you're looking at.
Yeah, and that's what you mean by at that end of that property price point, the low socioeconomic, you
can't expect a Mount Druitt to get to a double bay price. Even though it has phenomenal supply and demand dynamics, you would have to see a substantial shift in the economic underpinning of the area, and not a substantial one, but a rapid one as well. And this is where people talk about gentrification. Gentrification does happen. It happens. It's a slow burn. Yeah. It takes a long time to happen, decades. And not only that, it usually happens at either the higher end of the spectrum or the lower end of the spectrum. So what that means is that you can see an area shift from an ERSAT of 1 to 2, and it will take a long time. And you can see an area shift from an 8 to 9, and again, it will take a long time. Again, coming back to your question, as I said, the economic underpinning of the area does matter, and it's rare to see a Mount Druitt get to a double bay. Now, when it comes to investment, that doesn't really matter. We're not looking for such a substantial transition. Most of our properties that we do own are invested in areas where we potentially wouldn't live, because regretfully, society is a segregated entity, Like that's how it works, you know what I mean? So what you're looking at is those sweet spots or the collection of metrics that will give you the 100% growth, for example, in a decade, but you have to arrange the metrics in a particular way.
Big question. So someone listening at home, and let's say if they wanted to create a buyer brief for themselves, how would they create a buyer's brief for themselves?
Yeah, so buyer's brief range in complexity. So now buyer's brief is essentially a strategy. And what is a strategy? Strategy is a deconstructed end goal. You need to reverse engineer it all the way back, i.e., and this is there's a huge gap in the industry when it comes to this. So you need to, so people say, I want 150K positive cash flow in the next 2 decades. How do I get there? So you need to reverse engineer that to an initial purchase. Okay. Now, it can be very complex and there are a lot of things that would change in those 2 decades. So you need to allow for you need to make some certain assumptions, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
However, how I try to simplify it for our customers is I say, give me, as I said before, give me the budget, because budget informs what you can get. Remember the discussion about Mount Druitt and Double Bay?
Yeah.
Give me your budget. Give me your investment time horizon. Do you want a hotspot or a warm spot? And do you want, what's your risk profile? What is a risk profile? I'll address the hotspot and a warm spot later, but the risk profile would be usually risk is an insurance policy that you buy against negative growth. Addressing risk doesn't mean that you will inadvertently get substantial growth. It is an insurance policy. So we insure our cars, but we don't hope when we drive it out of the driveway that we're going to have a car accident.
Yeah.
But we still pay for the insurance. It is the same thing. So, for example, risk is industry centralization, exposed dominance of mining and agriculture, and negative environmental effects. Those are the top 3 or 4. But then you go into socio-economics, renter to owner ratios, hold periods, etc., which carry less of a weighting.
Right.
But if I had to assign dramatic weighting, I would assign it to industry centralization, dominance of mining and agriculture.
And industry centralization, unpack that.
Yeah, so it will be a mining town.
Yeah.
Why is industry centralization important? It's important because macroeconomic conditions change. When I say macroeconomic conditions, imagine you're investing in a coal town and suddenly China is not buying coal anymore. Do you know what I mean? So what happens?
It's happening now.
Absolutely. So what happens, and you usually see mining towns experience exorbitant growth in certain timeframes, but then they also see substantial declines as well because that industry suffers because of macroeconomic effects. So now let's say your investment timeframe is 10 years. Nobody's guaranteeing that within those 10 years we're going to have macroeconomic issues which will impact that industry, but you're buying an insurance policy against that, because the further you go into the future, the more uncertainty you invoke. And as I said, property is a game of probability. You're trying to increase the probability of a particular outcome, so you must address risk. What we see currently happening in the market is a lot of people are promoting certain suburbs in a single dimensional way. They don't consider all of these other multitude of factors which could greatly impact on your portfolio. And then coming back to your goal, to the reverse engineered goal, that means that your time frame of 20 years to get to your goal will prolong to 30 because an asset turns into a liability.
Just with industry centralization, is that what you're saying is multiple industries in a certain area?
Yeah.
So we're not relying on one...
Absolutely. So if one suffers, there's a couple of other industries to carry the weight.
Yep.
Even if, let's say, if one suffers in a town, and I don't have the stats in front of me, but let's say you have 5 dominant industries or 5 major industries in a town. If one suffers, you have another 4 which will still be generating cash flow for the families and inadvertently provide for their ability to purchase property. Now, there's a difference between ability to purchase property and willingness to purchase property. There are 2 distinct factors, and I'll give you an example. You have centralized industries such as human, where the median incomes are extremely high. So there's an ability to purchase property, but there's lack of willingness to purchase, which is why we see negative growth in a decade of minus 50%. So this is, people assume, and this is why a lot of people make assumptions that, okay, high medium incomes inadvertently translate to price growth. No, that doesn't mean, it doesn't have to happen. You know, you can have high medium incomes, but when the macroeconomic conditions affect the industry, there's no willingness to purchase. I want to save in my kitty so I can sustain myself for the next 20 years if I lose my job. So there's people always assume ability equals willingness. That doesn't happen. It's not the case. So you need to understand the difference.
So going back to designing a brief for yourself, it is your price point.
Price point, investment time horizon, Hotspot, Warmspot, risk profiles. Now, what is why Hotspot and a Warmspot? This comes down to the client's need to generate equity and leverage into additional purchases. So some clients want to generate substantial equity right from the get-go, which means that they need to invest in a hotspot. Now, what are the hallmarks of a hotspot? Hotspot would generate 10% plus growth for about 3.5 years on average, Now, it depends when you enter a hotspot, because you might enter a hotspot, it's already been a hotspot for the first year, so you potentially have another 2 years left. Now, it requires you to put pen and paper together and calculate whether that's suitable for you. However, the issue with going into hotspots is because, yes, you will generate substantial equity from the onset, but what will happen is you're going to be overpaying for that asset.
Yes.
So
because you're already in the middle.
You're already in a market where there's 20 people fighting for the same piece of real estate. So there's two negatives of a hotspot. First, the ability to find real estate that's suitable. Second is potentially overpaying for that real estate. So let's say that hotspot generates for you 10% growth in the next year, but you've overpaid 10%. So you've nullified the growth that happened in the first year.
Exactly my point, yes.
Correct. So now, why are warm spots very good? So warm spot is an area that will become a hotspot in the next 2 years. So you need to sit 2 years on the sidelines, and usually warm spot generate anywhere between -5 to +5% within that 2 year time frame. So if you really enter a warm spot at the beginning of it becoming a warm spot, it will be at around potentially 0% mark growth, and then it will start growing. And once it hits that 2 years mark, it will be generating about 5%, and then it skyrockets into 10% above and it becomes a hotspot. Right. And that way, you have the ability to enter a market, negotiate the price down because there's no high competition. And see, people usually consider equity generation only eventuating from market momentum. That's not the case. You can generate equity by discounting the price.
So my mentor always says, you make profit on the entry, on the purchase price.
You make money when you buy, not when you sell. That's the adage. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So this is what I always say to buyers agents. You need to explain to your clients that there are different ways of generating equity. And put it this way, let's say the area, the warm spot that you're entering into generates 0 to 5% growth in the first 2 years. But if you negotiated the price down by 50K, you already made some money and you can sit on the sidelines. Yeah. And I had an example recently. A buyer's agent called me, bought in a particular area. It was 550 advertised price. He was able to negotiate at 50K down, done a pest and building inspection. There was few issues, was able to negotiate at 20K further down, which means that for a 550 price point, he just made 70K equity, not taking into account LVR, and this is your domain, but it's 70K equity that is generated. Yeah. It is very rare for a hotspot to have such a exorbitant burst and generated in the first year. For that price point, what's that in percentage terms? You're better at maths. Let's say 25%. Let's throw it out there.
Yeah, wow. Can a warm spot ever become cold?
Absolutely, but only if you don't do it properly. If you don't layer the metrics in the appropriate way. Yeah. So now, layering the metrics comes down to economic narrative. So this is what I always teach. You first need to increase the data accuracy that you're looking at, which means that you're eliminating risk. Then you need to consider and buy an insurance policy, which is industry centralization. Now, I'm assuming that it's a long-term buy and hold, yeah? The second thing that you have to address is the affordability in order to be able to generate both internal and external demand. Yeah, so the property needs to be affordable for its residents. So once you've satisfied those 3 points or that criteria, then you move into supply. And a lot of people look at the demand side first. Yeah. I would say that that's incorrect. You need to look at the supply side first if you want to find a warm spot. So you need to restrict the supply. All of your supply side metrics need to be restricted, which means there's reducing supply in the area, which means that even small increases in demand from the owner-occupier cohort, remember the affordability, will lead to price growth and will turn a warm spot into a hot spot. So price growth is simple. Reducing supply, increasing demand. Yep. That's it. It's 101 investment and in any domain of life, whether it's share or crypto. So you need to have affordable area, you need to have a restricted supply, And even small increases in demand will lead to price growth, which will cause a positive feedback loop. And this has played out on regular occasion now. It's been 5 years that we've been doing it. Now, a warm spot can turn, first, a warm spot needs to have a reducing supply to be a warm spot, okay? Your question was, can a warm spot turn into a cold spot? The answer to that would be yes, if it doesn't have a reducing supply. But if that's the case, it's not even a warm spot to begin with.
So something would have to drastically happen in that area for it to
absolutely. So put it this way. So as I said before, initially, property is an illiquid asset, which means that trend is your friend. Trend equals direction. So if you're establishing 4, 5, 6 year trends in your supply metrics, and if they're nosediving, for the trend to shift to neutral or to even increasing supply, it will require a consequent 1.5 years of extreme stock on market. And that never happens in property. So usually you would have, let's say, 1 month an increasing stock, but then it drops to another month. And that doesn't impact the overall trend. It still forcefully declines. So for the trend to actually reverse, first, it takes a long time. And second, it takes some circumstance where you have an influx of property to the market that's very substantial to shift the trend. Now we come back to this, usual vacant land, vacant land also doesn't equal oversupply, because even vacant land takes time. First, you have release schedules by council, and because investing is a game of cash flow. First, both councils and developers will never develop everything all at once. It doesn't happen. And I always say to people,
because there's a game behind that.
There's a cash flow game.
There's a release, and there's a
like first, you don't have the money to release everything at once. Because of the cash flow. And second, there's a restraint when it comes to building as well. Even building itself has a time frame and has a process. So I always say to people when they see, now, vacant land can be one of the things that you consider as a potential risk, but then look at the building approval ratio and its trend. If the building approval ratio trend is trending downwards and you have vacant land, explain to me and give me a coherent methodology of why you're assuming that this vacant land will lead to an oversupply at a particular point in time. So give me an explanation that I can consider and say, I forgot about that. Doesn't exist.
It doesn't happen.
So, and I always say to people, when you see vacant land in a suburb, think about it this way. Everything is common sense. Think about it this way. If you have vacant land in a suburb, it would stand to reason that there was more vacant land before in the past. Then look at the price curve of the area. Why aren't we seeing strong deviations to the downside from oversupply for about 30 years? Because if there was an oversupply from vacant land in the past, because there was more vacant land before, the oversupply would dampen price growth, and then we will see it from the curve actually going down. People overcomplicate things for whatever reason, and they try to, it's a very simple analysis game, but I think the industry needs to change and the mindset needs to change, because there are certain assumptions and myths that are adopted. For example, infrastructure investment in an area leads to price growth. Incorrect. And it's not direct. And what's the time frame? What's the time frame of me building roads and bridges and that actually going into pockets of individuals' ability, and then that ability transferring to willingness to purchase? The time frame, that you can have huge lags there. You know what I mean? And it's a secondary aspect as well. So it does impact, don't get me wrong, it does impact, but let's layer it appropriately. Let's first go as close as we can to the point of purchase, which is supply and demand on the ground, i.e. the supply metrics and demand metrics, and then you layer on top, you layer that cake to come at a more coherent narrative. That's fine. But don't just assume infrastructure spending, that equals price growth and that's it, without looking at the supply and demand dynamics.
Makes sense.